Moses is a hero. Young people today might say he was an alpha or the GOAT. He was the absolute legend of the people of God. The first 5 books of the Bible chronicle a bunch of his story, and he is the major hero in most of it. He was called by God in spite of his past. He was born into a common family. He was then under the threat of death. He ends up making his way through some circumstances into being adopted into the Pharaoh's household. He then has a crisis of identity where he meets his people and sees what's happening to his people, where he comes from, that are enslaved. He gets in a fight and kills one of his dad's people, the Pharaoh's people, from his house, protecting his own people, the Israelites. And at that point, no one wanted him. He was a murderer, he was a traitor, and he went on the run out into the wilderness. But no matter what his past was, no matter what he had done, no matter what mistakes he had made, God kept coming after him. And so God finds him in the wilderness and speaks to him through a bush that's burning but not consumed. Moses is drawn near and hears the voice of God, and the voice of God says, "Go back to where you're from, speak to the Pharaoh, and tell him to let my people go, the slaves, the Israelites." Moses is, of course, a little confused and a little afraid. But he goes back and he does just this, and he finds that God is faithful to support him every step along the way. There are miracles. There are plagues. There are oratories. There's leadership of the people. And eventually, Pharaoh has had enough of what God does through Moses. And Moses demands that the slaves be freed, and Pharaoh lets them go. And so the people begin a journey onto the promised land. Moses keeps casting this vision of where God is leading them from and where God is leading them to. He will take you out of bondage, and he will lead you into a land flowing with milk and honey. And the people, surely nervous, surely scared, pack up all their belongings, all of their livestock, all of their family, and they go. Pharaoh, of course, realizes he's losing his best and cheapest workforce. And so he sends his army after Moses and the people. And Moses gets to the Red Sea, and he lifts his hand above the Red Sea, and the waters part. And the people of Israel, God's people, are saved once again by yet another miracle of God. They make it to the other side on dry land, and the waters crash down on the Egyptian army that's following them. The people are now on an adventure towards God's next. And Moses keeps casting the vision of what God has for them. A promised land, promised to their forefathers. A land flowing with milk and honey. But the people struggle. They struggle to see Moses' vision. They struggle to match his resolve. In each and every step along the way, they become obstinate and to be fair, sometimes ridiculous. If you've read these 5 chapters, you'll notice there's this theme that comes over, or 5 books, I'm sorry, not chapters. This theme that emerges over and over again. The people run into trouble, and they come and they gripe to Moses. And they gripe almost the same way every time. And distant from that story, it seems utterly ridiculous. The griping goes like this: Moses, you led us out into the wilderness to die. At least when we were slaves in Egypt, there was pots of meat on the fire every night for us to eat. And so what they're saying in essence is, yeah, slavery was bad, but at least we got fed. It's ridiculous. Freedom is better than slavery, absolutely. But there's sometimes just a fear of where we're going and what we don't know, that we can also become obstinate and difficult. And God doesn't always show us with crystal clarity where we're going. And Moses had to live in this middle space, convinced by the presence of God, convinced by the call of God, convinced that God's future was preferable, and having to articulate this back to an Israelite people who were scared, uncertain, had a past that was no good, but at least it was tangible. The future was intangible, therefore it was scary. Now, Moses eventually makes a catastrophic mistake. You see, he's always complaining to God that these Israelites are difficult to lead and they're obstinate and they won't listen and they won't do what God has asked them to do. But then Moses himself becomes that person. You see, once again, the Israelites come up to Moses and they complain the same. You led us out into a desert and we're thirsty. Where are we going to get water from? It was better back in Egypt. I've heard people say before, this cracks me up, that churches sometimes are kind of hard to change. Churches don't always like change. And so that there tends to be in church culture a back to Egypt committee. It's always saying, hey, the past was bad, but at least it was our past, right? And so the back to Egypt committee is coming up to Moses saying, it was better back then. It was better when we were enslaved. It was better when we were working double shifts and getting no money from it. It was better then because we had pots of meat at night, and now we don't even have water and we're in a desert. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a meteorologist. Science was probably my worst subject in school, but I do know that when you're walking around in the desert and thirsty, and all you have is a rock, you're not likely to get water from that rock. I do know that. And yet Moses goes to God with this complaint again. He's frustrated. He's tired of these complaints. He just wants to get to the promised land and leave these people. Oh, they'll stop complaining when they have their new promised land. And God says, well, we'll give them water to drink. Why don't you go over to the rock and lift your hands in front of the rock, and then water will spring and flow out of it. And Moses goes and he walks up to the rock. He leads the Back to Egypt committee there. And instead of lifting his hands, he takes his staff and he whacks the rock. And sure enough, the rock breaks open and water pours out of it. And you might think, that's a pretty good miracle. I'm impressed. I certainly have never drawn water out of a rock before. But God is not impressed. And I think, why wouldn't God be impressed? Well, you see, Moses ends up doing it his own way, in his own strength, his own power, whacking the rock. He was told to just lift his hands, to let God be glorified, let God be God before the people. But now Moses has become the griping, won't listen to God's instructions person that he always complains to God that the Israelites are. And so God calls Moses back to him. They have one of their little powwows and meetings. And God says to Moses, you have sinned because you didn't listen to me. You did not trust me enough, is what God says. And so he's going to punish Moses. And the punishment he gives Moses is that Moses won't be able to lead the people into the promised land. That's a harsh punishment. Moses didn't sign up for this job, and now he's 4 decades deep into leading a difficult people out of slavery from the biggest superpower in the area, wandering through the wilderness, listening to every gripe and complaint in the book. I don't know if you've ever been a parent and driven children on a road trip. Like a 10-hour road trip can be really long. Are we there yet? My Nintendo's battery doesn't work anymore. Why aren't we there? He's touching me. She's looking at me. 10 hours can be long. Moses is 40 years into the Israelites saying, she's looking at me. And now he doesn't even get the payoff. He doesn't get to go in and experience the land of his forefathers. He doesn't get to experience the land flowing with milk and honey, the vision that he's been casting to them for decades now. God does, however, decide to meet him in the middle. There's always grace, even in the punishment. Moses, now an old man, is allowed to come to the very edge of the promised land, to walk up on the mountain at the edge and look down into the beautiful land flowing with milk and honey. After 40 years of difficult leadership, he sees it. He doesn't live there, but he sees it. God's promise comes to fulfillment. And when this happened, we're told in the scripture that Moses dies. Even the people of Israel don't know where his body was laid. His final act of life is to see where God had led them, but not quite be able to walk in. And so, we move into our scripture text today in Joshua chapter 1. Moses is dead, and the people's journey is not done. So we ask ourselves, who's going to take over? Who has that kind of charisma? Who has that kind of gravitas? Who has that kind of call on their life? Who has that kind of ability to fit in the shoes of literally Moses? I suppose there's a hint in the text that I'm telling you we're going to read today. But Joshua ends up being the guy. And in the very, very first words of the book of Joshua, we are told that the situation may seem dire, but God remains faithful. Would you stand with me as we read Joshua chapter 1, verses 1 to 9 today? Starting at the very beginning, in an odd place. Stories don't usually begin with deaths. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide, Moses, my servant, is dead. One of the bluntest texts in scriptures right there. Moses is dead. Now then, you and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I am about to give them, to the Israelites. I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. Your territory will extend from the desert to Lebanon, from the great river, the Euphrates, all the Hittite country to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. No one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As it is with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give them. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Keep this book of the law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Moses is dead. Imagine the weight and the grief. You imagine that the people who have followed him, who've trusted him to some degree or another for 40 years might be paralyzed about what is next. Moses was the epitome, the leader of God's call in their lives. They trusted him to leave the slavery of Egypt and to head to this promised land. They may have had their quarrels, they may have had their disagreements, they may have had their fears, but they kept following. Moses was the one who would go up on the mountain and hear from God and then come down and tell them what God was up to and what God was doing. And now the mouthpiece of God, the leader of God, the person they followed is dead. Death can be hard to follow up from. If you've known someone close to you in your life who's died, it can feel really hard to know where to go from here. What is life going to be like? How do you grieve a parent or a child or a friend that's been so close to you, that's been so meaningful to you? How do you put one foot in front of another when your world is rocked and changed that hard? the people must be wondering, what is next? How are we going to proceed? Is there anyone amongst us who could possibly do what Moses has done? He was the embodiment and the epitome of who they were becoming and the God who they followed. But Joshua steps up. Joshua is called by God. And we get this powerful word in the text. Moses, my servant, is dead, period. Now then. God isn't finished. God isn't reliant on Moses. God's entire plan carries on and moves forward even after death. Now, this may be a scary or hard word to hear or to embrace, but none of our deaths, none of our lives are necessary for what God is doing. God's mission, God's purpose, God's call carries on between the years or after the years that we're given. Any one of us in here may live to be 100. Some of us may live to be 55. Some of us may get even less than that. And we begin to start seeing the world because of how we're made through our own lenses and start to think that maybe we're the center of the world, that God's primarily concerned about me. But Moses has died. Moses. And God's word for Joshua is now then. Keep going. There's more to accomplish. My plan, my call, my promise to you and your people is not reliant on Moses. Any one of us can come or go, but God remains. God keeps working. God still has a vision and a plan for humanity. God is at work beyond any one of our lives. And Joshua may think, okay, we got to keep going, but how am I going to do this? And God says, as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. Well, the way he was with Moses was miracles, healings, plagues, oracles, prayers, sermons, wisdom, leadership, commandments, law. God was with Moses in incredibly powerful ways. The stories are epic, one after another. And the power that seemed to be located in Moses, it seems like Moses is the one, the charismatic leader. It seems like Moses is God's called one. It seems like Moses is God's plan. And God is saying, no, I can do the same thing through you, dude. God remains active and faithful no matter if we live or die. God is up to something, and God's plan does not rely on us. Now, if you see yourself as the center of the world, that probably sounds like bad news. But if you see God as the center of the world, you say, thank God, because I am not the center of the world. I'm not capable of holding that much of a burden. But God is. God works through us, but also beyond us and past us. God works with us, but God also works around us. God isn't reliant on us, but God calls us and uses us and invites us into his plan and purpose. This is such a word of grace, if you can step back and think about it. We're not necessary, but God calls us to participate anyways. So Moses wasn't necessary, and now Joshua is finding out that it was God who was the one who was leading them all the time. That Moses was a good leader, was a good vessel, an honest follower of God's call, but Joshua has every bit the ability and access to God's power that Moses did. And so how do we move on? How does he get forward? How does he take the next step? Well, God tells him one thing 3 times in this text. He says, this is your role, dude. I'm going to work through you. All the power that Moses has is going to be through you, but you have to be strong and courageous. And he says it 3 times in 9 verses. Be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous. This is the call that Joshua gets. all of the miracles, all of the planning, all of the direction, all of the strength, all of the power, God's going to provide that. What's next? How's it going to happen? God's going to show up. You have to be strong and courageous. And I think if we can trust God at His word, if we can put ourselves in a position where we believe that God's power is available to us in the way that it was to Moses, if we can really, really trust that, then we can bring our part that Joshua did. We can be strong and courageous because we've seen God act in the past. And we can trust that God is going to do that in the future as well. Be strong and courageous. Now, it might be exciting to sit in this moment of the text where they're about to walk into the promised land. Something big is going to happen. Joshua is being raised up. It is possible to live in that moment of the text and get excited. But I got to admit, I kind of feel bad for Moses. You feel bad for Moses? Then I get kind of worried too. I read these scriptures and I think, what does this mean? And one of the things I get nervous about reading this text is Moses clearly wasn't perfect, but dude, his sin didn't seem that bad to me. The difference between raising his hands and whacking the rock, I begin to think, I'm a pretty imperfect dude. My wife is not here in this service, but she would gladly testify to all the problems that I bring to the table, right? At times I can be jealous. I find that sometimes I get involved in gossip. I'm not even interested in that, but I talk about people when they're not around. I can want more than I deserve. Sometimes I can love money more than I want to. I can be arrogant and full of myself. I can be unkind. I can be sharp with my tongue. I'm still being worked on by God, let me tell you. And it seems like what Moses did was, I don't know, not as bad as some of the things I do. And so I think, am I in trouble here? Am I looking at the fate of Moses, or am I like Joshua, ready to move into God's future and accept God's call in my life? Which one of these people am I more like? And wrestling with that question can be kind of scary because I can see a little bit of myself in both of them. I'm not dead yet. I have a future. God's calling me somewhere. But at the same time, God was pretty mad at Moses, and that punishment was pretty severe. And I'm not exactly sure that I'm less innocent than Moses was in this text. And so what is the solution here? With kind of one foot in the story of Moses and one foot in the story of Joshua, what am I going to do with this text? And I think that maybe there's some help, especially in the New Testament. As we carry on with the story of God, we keep learning new things that maybe Moses himself didn't have the good fortune to learn on his own. Because eventually Jesus comes along and begins to sort some of these questions for us, to give us new language to think about how to wrestle with things like life and death, how to wrestle with things like sin and forgiveness, how to wrestle with what our fate might be one way or the other. And in Matthew chapter 16, Jesus begins to invite us to die ourselves. It seems like Moses gets this harsh ending. He's just dead. His bones get buried, and the whole world moves on without him. But Jesus seems to have a conclusion for us about death that may help us avoid just seeing our bones going in the ground as the end of our story. This is what Jesus says. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their souls?" See, Moses ended up not gaining the whole world. He ended up dying. And the death is tragic and it's sad and it's awful. But Jesus is saying here, you and I, through the work of Jesus, the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, don't have to be defined by the death that we will one day experience. There's not one of us in this room, I promise you, that's going to escape death. It's coming. One day we will receive the fate of Moses. We may be short of a big goal. We may not have lived all that we believe that we deserve. We might make it to really old age and think, come and take me any day, Jesus. We all are going to die different, and we're all going to die. But what Jesus is saying here is, you don't have to be defined by that death. That death is coming, but through Jesus on the cross and in the tomb and in the resurrection, he has been made Lord over even death. And so he's saying to us, die to yourself now. Make the choice today to give up your dreams, your goal, your lordship over your own life. Start submitting yourself to God's call on your life, and you'll find that if you follow him, you will be made new, and life will be different, but it'll be better. And you'll be less dominated by the death that is to come in your own life. He says it another way in John chapter 3. Jesus talks about death all the time. And every time it's an invitation to die now. Now, he's not calling for mass suicide. He's just saying, die to your own selfish ambition. Die to the way you drew it up. Die to your sin. Die to your addiction. Die to your hurts. Just let all that go and submit yourself to the life of Jesus. This is the way Jesus says it. Very truly, I tell you, no one can see the kingdom of God unless they are born again. Born again means, well, I stopped living the old way. I stopped doing it the way I did it before. I stopped living as if I was Lord and Savior of this world. I stopped living in the way that I want to do things, as if I'm the king. And instead, I've died to that and made Jesus king over my life in my world. Jesus over and over and over again invites us to die now. And if we die now, if we submit ourselves to this spiritual death, where we take all of our sin, all of our addiction, all of our hurts, all of our rage, all of our mistakes, all of our past, all of our anxieties, all of our fears, and we die to all of that, then we begin to live a completely different life, unconcerned about what day our body might expire. Because that day will come one way or the other. But that doesn't begin to define us. That's no longer who we are. And we find that in Jesus, we're invited to live before that, through that, and after that. And the beauty of this is Moses dies and God keeps going. And if we could die to ourselves now, we find joy in this fact that God doesn't need me. God partners with me. He uses me, he works with me in relationship for a time. And when my time is done, I say, okay. Because I've died to my own way a long time ago. And what I think is beautiful about this image, even though it's scary, we don't like talking about death. Like we Americans, dude, we are obsessed with life. We are obsessed with having more surgeries. We're obsessed with more treatments. We're obsessed with living to 100. We are obsessed with living. We are trying to avoid death at all costs. And I'm not talking about you, I'm talking about me. I don't want to die. We're obsessed with living. And here Jesus is saying, turn this on its head, man. Chasing after the life you think is the good life is what really is going to kill you. But living life the way that I've called you to live, there's no expiration on that. You can be made new and you could live forever. And we find that all of the things that consume us, that make life difficult, well, if we die to ourselves, think about it. A dead person doesn't have cowardice. A dead person doesn't have addiction. A dead person doesn't struggle with being offended. A dead person doesn't struggle with loneliness. A dead person doesn't struggle with anxiety, depression. If we die to ourselves, we begin to think that all of the trials and troubles of this world that we're holding on to, they no longer own us. And I want to tell you some stories as we close this out today of where this is happening in our church that I see most clearly. I look at our teen group, and I've heard multiple of our teens in our church. Every Wednesday night they meet in here. There's about 90 to 100 teens every single week in this room on Wednesday night. And this summer, they've been leading themselves, telling the story about how God has been reaching and meeting them in their lives. And the stories are incredible. It's their own testimonies that at 14, 15, 16 years old, they are dying to their selves. They're dying to the way they had been doing it, because the way that they were doing it was killing them. I've heard stories this summer about recreational use of drugs and how God freed them from using drugs. I've heard stories this summer from our teens about jealousy and loneliness rooted in social media use. How they'd sit in their room all alone for hour upon hour scrolling through their phone, just telling themselves about how they're not included and how brokenhearted that makes them. And then God met them at teen camp and grafted them into a youth group, and they found a new life with connection and joy in God. I've heard stories about suicidal ideation and how God sent someone to them at just the last minute in order to remind them that they're not alone. I've heard of diagnoses of anxiety and depression in which God has told them they are more than just their anxiety and depression. Now, anxiety and depression isn't a choice you make. You can't just choose yourself out of it, right? But when you begin to see yourself as a part of a bigger story and a God who created you, that loves you and is near you, it helps you manage. The things that make you anxious and depressed don't feel ultimate when God is what is ultimate. And God begins to help you through those seasons. These stories are incredible about how at 14, 15, 13, 16, 18, our teens are deciding that the story that they've been given about what the good life looks like has left them empty and lonely and broken, and God met them, and they died to the stories that they've been given and have become alive to Christ. And now what the world can do to them no longer hurts them. There's joy, there's victory, there's trajectory in their life that there wasn't before. And then once we die to ourselves and become alive to God, we then are left with Joshua's call, be strong and courageous. And so I want to tell you the story of my daughter, one of our teens here, about her being strong and courageous, because she was one of the people who testified this summer. There's a lot of baggage and weight with being a pastor's kid. All of her friends know it. She's always expected to be Miss Christian, both in the church and outside of the church. And she had to buy this for herself. She had to decide this is who she was going to be. And so she has decided that she's going to be Christian and that she's going to be public about this. And so it's not always easy, but she texts me one day. This was just a couple of weeks ago. I'm sitting in my office. I'm working. I'm a pastor. My job is to be like professionally and publicly Christian, right? And I get this text from her that says, I just preached in my history class. And I'm thinking, I haven't preached today, and you're in public school, and you're preaching. What does this mean? And so I asked her for a little bit more information, trying to figure out what in the world. And then I'm all, like side note, she's not here in this service, she's in the first service, so I'll tell you this. I'm also kind of hoping she's not like on a stand with a microphone yelling at them, like, I'm hoping that that's not the daughter I raised, She goes, no, I was in history class, and my history teacher asked the whole class, do any of you know what a parable is? And of course I know, fill in the blank, because I've been listening to you drone on for 16 years. Right, of course I know what a parable is, but I didn't want to be the one to answer. And so he keeps saying, really, none of you know what parables are? What about the parable of the prodigal son? None of you know what the parable of the prodigal son is? And she's looking around the room, and she knows what the parable of the prodigal son is. And she's seeing no one else raise their hand. She goes, all right. So she goes, I started answering it. There's 2 sons, they have a big inheritance. One leaves and squanders it, She thinks, all right, I'll break the ice and then someone else will finish it, right? And he goes, well, okay, what else happened? Anyone else know? No one's answering. And so finally she's like, that's it, I'm in. And so she goes in on the parable of the prodigal son, talking about God's extravagant love, that even though this one person has squandered everything, the Father is waiting and loves him, and we're supposed to know that that's the way that God loves us. We can sin and squander and go away, and God will still welcome us into her household. My daughter is telling the story of the prodigal son in a public high school. Yeah, I don't know if you know this or not. I see all of these stories on the news and in the newspaper about how teens are today. Dude, the teens are okay. They're okay. When they come to believe something, they're way better than many of our generations were back in the day, trying to separate and to keep our public and private life apart. That was the way it was in the 90s for me. Right? We wanted to try to keep some private things away from public things. We tried to have different personas in different places. When our young people today believe, man, they're going to believe. They're going to do it. And I was really proud of her. And I'm not trying to act like she's the best kid ever, right? I can make a list of her problems as well, right? We're not all perfect, but it's amazing. It's amazing that God gives us these chances. When we die to ourselves, when we're not afraid of what people are going to say about us anymore, when we're not afraid that we can get canceled or crucified or sent to the edge or anything like that, when we've died to ourselves and we become alive to God, God gives us these opportunities to be strong and courageous. And then we can testify in front of a world that their system's not working. Their system's not working. They keep telling us what the good life is like, and it keeps leading to brokenness and loneliness and addiction and debt, and it's a struggle out there, man, and people are looking for something bigger and better. And if we're willing to die to ourselves so that we might live the way that God calls us to, not only will we be saved, but then we could be strong and courageous for the sake of others as well. And so today, as we sing our final song, I want to invite you to stand and sing, but also, if God is calling you to die to yourself, to become alive to Him, come to the altar and say yes. Speak to God. God is faithful to listen. And I think we're getting to this place again where people are ashamed to admit that they're got a problem or they're not fully in. Don't be ashamed. Come and pray. Be bold. Ask God to help you, to bring you to life, to help you to die to sin that's corrosive and killing, and help you to become alive to a God that wants to see you prosper and live eternally. Say yes to Jesus that you might follow Him and become a disciple. It starts today. Would you stand as we sing this final song?